Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today I will take you to the faraway land of Trinidad and Tobago and tell you the story of A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul. 10 weeks before he died, Mr. Mohan Biswas lost his job. He was a journalist living on Sikkim Street in Port of Spain. He had been sick for some time, spending more than 9 weeks in the hospital and even more time recovering at home. When the doctor told him to rest completely, his employer, the Trinidad Sentinel, had to let him go. They gave him 3 months' notice and kept sending him a free copy of the newspaper until he died. Biswas was 46 years old and had 4 children. He and his wife, Shama, had no money. They owed $3,000 on their house and had been trying to pay off this debt for 4 years. They had to pay $20 a month just in interest. Additionally, they had to pay $10 a month in ground rent. 2 of their children were still in school, and the other 2 older ones were studying abroad on scholarships. Despite their struggles, Shama didn't run to her mother for help like she would have done 10 years ago. Instead, she came up with her own plan. She suggested, "We can start selling potatoes. We can buy them for 5 cents a pound and sell them for 7. Mr. Biswas dismissed the idea because many people were already selling potatoes. He thought selling the car was a better idea. They never talked about selling potatoes again. And Mr. Biswas stopped mentioning selling the car. Mr. Biswas respected Shama's optimism and trusted her. Since they moved into their own house, Shama had shown new loyalty to him and their children. Away from her mother and sisters, she could express herself freely. To Mr. Biswas, this felt as good as owning his own house. Biswas considered the house his own, even though it was heavily mortgaged for years. He loved the freedom of walking through his own front gate, closing his doors and windows at night and hearing only his family's sounds. He remembered how, as a boy, he had moved from one stranger's house to another, and after his marriage, he had lived in his in-laws' houses. His in-laws, the Tulsis, were a well-known Hindu family in Trinidad. They were religious, conservative landowners, descended from the famous Pandit Tulsi. Though no one knows why he came to Trinidad as a laborer, his family's fame in India made them important in Trinidad too. Now about Mr. Biswas's house. It was well known in St. James for its unique look. It had 2 stories and a corrugated iron roof. A solicitor's clerk who built houses as a hobby designed and built it. He bought swampy land and used frames from dismantled American army camps. The house had a small kitchen, an L-shaped living and dining room, and an always wet concrete bathroom upstairs. Facing west, it got very hot in the afternoons. The only comfortable spots were the kitchen and the bathroom. The solicitor's clerk had forgotten to include a proper staircase. The wooden staircase he added later was unstable and covered by a sloping corrugated iron roof. Mr. Biswas had paid $5,500 for this house. Biswas always thought new modern concrete houses were too expensive for him. When he found this one, he was impressed by its solid, respectable look. He never saw it during the hottest part of the day. His first visit was on a rainy afternoon, and his second visit with his children was in the evening. There were cheaper houses available, but they were old, decaying, and crowded. This house seemed luxurious in comparison. The clerk lived in each house he built until he started another one. He lived with his widowed mother, who served Mr. Biswas tea and cakes. The affection between the son and the mother reminded Mr. Biswas of his own mother, who had died in poverty. Shama didn't like the house from the beginning. Mr. Biswas accused her of preferring to live with her mother and family. News of them buying a house had spread among Shama's family, and they teased her about it. On the day they bought the house, they began to notice its flaws. A dangerous staircase, a sagging upper floor, and no back door. The windows didn't close properly, and there were gaps that let bats in. They were very disappointed, but quickly adapted and began to see it as their home. When he returned from the hospital, he found the house ready for him with a neat garden, freshly painted walls, and his car in the garage. He was amazed by how welcoming it felt and couldn't believe he had created this world. There was the old kitchen safe, unused typewriter, broken hat rack, bookcase made by an unemployed blacksmith, the cheap dining table, and an unusable bed. Although they had their flaws, these possessions had become a part of their life, and the house was the best part of all. It would have been awful to die at the Tulsi's messy place, leaving Shama and the kids in one room. Owning his own house was a big accomplishment for Mr. Biswas. It showed his determination. The life of Mr. Biswas began with turmoil. Just before he was born, his parents, Bipti and Raghu, had a fight. Fed up with Raghu's stinginess, Bipti took her 3 children and walked in the scorching sun to her mother's village. She complained to her mother, Bisundai, about how Raghu controlled every cent, counted every biscuit, and walked miles just to save a penny. Bipti's father was weakened by asthma. He blamed fate for all his troubles. Fate had brought him from India to the sugar estate, aged him, and left him to die in a crumbling mud hut. Bisundai called the midwife, made food for Bipti's children, and prepared beds for them. Mr. Biswas was born with 6 fingers, which was considered bad luck. Bipti hung cactus leaves over every door and window to ward off evil spirits, but the midwife said the boy would bring misfortune. The next morning, a pandit arrived and predicted the boy would have gaps in his teeth, making him a pervert, a spendthrift, and possibly a liar. The 6 fingers were a bad sign. He should be kept away from water and would have an unlucky sneeze. His father must not see him for 21 days. On the 21st day, the father must see the boy's reflection in a brass plate filled with coconut oil. The Pandit suggested the name Mohan, meaning beloved, which is a name given to Lord Krishna. Biswas's 6th finger fell off before he was 9 days old. Bisundai saw this as a good sign and buried the finger behind the cowshed near where Mr. Biswas's navel string was buried. He was treated with care, massaged with coconut oil, and exercised daily. On the 9th day, Bisundai invited villagers to celebrate. The Pandit was pleased, the barber played his drum, and a man performed the Shiva dance. Raghu, Mr. Biswas's father, arrived unexpectedly, and he was angry that they were celebrating without him. Bisundai called him a lousy father for driving his wife away. The boy's unlucky sneeze frightened Raghu, and he agreed to see him only on the 21st day as the Pandit had prescribed. Bisundai prepared the oil, and on the 21st day, Raghu saw his son's reflection in the oil. Mr. Biswas cried, his face distorted in the reflection. Life continued with Mr. Biswas's unlucky sneeze. Raghu, afraid of bad luck, often stayed home if Mr. Biswas sneezed before he left for work. Biswas grew up. Though he suffered from malnutrition and sores, he never felt hungry and didn't mind not going to school, but he disliked being forbidden to go near water. He played with his sister Tehuti, while his brothers Pratap and Prasad worked with the buffaloes at the estate and felt important in their roles. One day, Mr. Biswas was given the job of taking care of the neighbor Dhari's calf. He loved the calf and took it for walks. During one walk, he found a stream and spent time there. But he lost the calf while watching the fish. Scared, he decided to hide under his father's bed. When Dhari came looking for his calf, the villagers began searching for him. Thinking Mr. Biswas might be in danger, Raghu, his father, dived into the pond to look for him. They found the dead calf in the stream, but during the search, Raghu drowned. The family was devastated. Tara, Bipti's sister, came to help. She arranged the funeral and took charge of the situation. One night, Dhari and a few others started digging in the yard, looking for money they believed Raghu had buried. When Bipti resisted, they threatened to return every night. Bipti had no choice but to sell the hut and the land to Dhari. Tara took Dehuti away, and Mr. Biswas and his mother moved to Pegotes to live with some relatives of Tara's husband. Pratap and Prasad, Biswas's two brothers, were sent to live and work full-time on the sugarcane estate at Felicity. Biswas started to feel alone and abandoned, and it started a new chapter in his life. He could never exactly pinpoint where his father's hut had stood or where Dhari and others had dug for Raghu's money. He never knew if anyone found it, though it couldn't have been much since Raghu earned so little. However, the land Bipti sold to Dhari was later found to be rich with oil. When Mr. Biswas worked on a feature article about the oil discovery, he returned to his childhood place and found only oil pumps. The pond and stream had been replaced by a garden city with white bungalows and neat gardens. His early years had left no trace in the transformed landscape. At school, Mr. Biswas's teacher, Lai, asked for a birth certificate. Mr. Biswas's mother, Bipti, realized they didn't have one. They visited F.Z. Kearney, a solicitor who created an affidavit to officially record Biswas's birth. School life was tough. Lai often begged students for their mistakes. Despite the strict environment, Mr. Biswas learned English and subjects like geography, arithmetic, and history. He became friends with Alec, who introduced him to mischief like flattening nails on railway tracks and smoking cigarettes. He also learned sign painting. In spite of their friendship, Mr. Biswas knew little about Alec's home life. It's as if they silently agreed to keep their homes secret from each other. Biswas lived in a mud hut with his mother. She often felt disheartened by their circumstances. His older brothers, Pratap and Prasad, seemed like strangers to him. His sister Dehuti, who was working as a servant in Tara's house, ran away with a yard boy, bringing disgrace to the family. At this time, Mr. Biswas began reading a weekly newspaper column to Tara's husband, Ajodha. Tara saw his potential as a priest and took him out of school to apprentice with Jairam, the local pandit. As Jairam's assistant, Mr. Biswas helped with various duties, including assisting in religious ceremonies, performing puja for Jairam's household. Jairam was strict. Once, Biswas ate 2 bananas from Jairam's share, and as a punishment, Jairam made him eat 7 bananas, which made him sick and caused lifelong stomach trouble. Eventually, Jairam sent him away when Biswas improperly used and disposed of an unclean handkerchief. Biswas returned home, unwelcome and disheartened. He then worked at Tara's rum shop under her brother Bhandat, who stole from the shop and blamed Mr. Biswas. After a beating from Bhandat, Mr. Biswas left and returned to his mother. He looked for a job but struggled. Ramchand, Dehuti's husband, and Biswas's brother-in-law invited him to their home. Mr. Biswas found it difficult to connect with his sister and felt even more isolated. He began painting signs with Alec and read extensively. He learned to appreciate the beauty of letters and the art of sign painting. Alec convinced him to work with him as a sign painter. Later, Biswas became a conductor on one of Ajodha's buses, which ran in competition with other buses on a route without fixed stops. He enjoyed the excitement and rivalry, relishing the urgent motion and noisy competition, singing to people on the road. He also visited certain houses with Alec, which introduced him to new aspects of life that terrified, attracted, and amused him. These experiences added to his complex feelings about love and romance. Alec assured him that these things happen unexpectedly, but Mr. Biswas continued to worry and wait for life to offer its sweetness. He took a painting job at Hanuman House in the town of Arvakas, where he finally met Shama. Hanuman House was a solid white fortress with thick concrete walls. A statue of the monkey god Hanuman crowned the flat roof. It housed both the Tulsi store and the Tulsi family, one of the most prominent families in the region. They were known among the Hindus as pious and conservative landowning family. The founder, Pandit Tulsi, was a mysterious figure and there were many rumors about him. He died in a car accident, but that became the subject of a comedy song. In spite of his death, the respect he commanded continued with the family in Trinidad. His daughter, Mrs. Tulsi, and her brother-in-law, Seth, managed the estate and fortune. They were the ones who hired Mr. Biswas to paint Hanuman House. Seth aggressively negotiated Mr. Biswas's payment. Despite its promising front, the store was a cramped, poorly lit space filled with awkward columns and cobwebbed corners. While working, Mr. Biswas found himself particularly enchanted by Shama, a slender and attractive girl with a charming smile. After exchanging glances with Shama for several days, Mr. Biswas decided to write her a note, which he left on the counter for her to find. Before she could read it, Shama got caught up in a dispute with the customer. The customer accused Shama of insulting her by offering black stockings instead of the flesh-colored ones that she had requested. Mrs. Tulsi calmed the customer by giving her a free pair of stockings, but she also discovered the note. Mr. Biswas was embarrassed. He left the store. The next day, Mrs. Tulsi and Seth questioned him about the note. It became clear to Mr. Biswas that he was expected to marry Shama, not out of love, but because he was a suitable Brahmin. The following day, Mrs. Tulsi invited him to have lunch with her, and by the end of the meal, Mr. Biswas agreed to marry Shama. The ceremony was simple, and Biswas found himself a part of the Tulsi household. His life became a mix of rebelling against the family's expectations and trying to carve out his independence. He continued sign painting, trying to avoid the family's estate work. He often argued with Mrs. Tulsi and Seth and was disrespected even by the children in the house. Shama rarely took his side. She was oscillating between loyalty to her family and support for her husband. After another argument with the Tulsi family, Seth sent Mr. Biswas and Shama to a remote village called the Chase. They were to manage an old shop there. Although the shop was in a very isolated place and it was not likely that they were going to make much money, Mr. Biswas saw it as a victory. He and Shama finally gained some independence from the Tulsi family. The village of the Chase was a long, scattered settlement of mud huts in the heart of the sugarcane area. It was so remote that it was connected to the outside world only by the villagers' carts and bicycles, wholesalers' vans and lorries, and an occasional private motor bus with no fixed route or timetable. Mr. Biswas and Shama, who was pregnant, moved to the Chase to run a small food shop. They lived at the back of the shop in 2 small rooms with unplastered mud walls and a roof of old, rough thatch. Although the shop and living quarters were in poor condition, there was plenty of space, including abandoned land where villagers' cows grazed. The Tulsis had bought this unprofitable property on Seth's advice. As a member of the local road board, he believed a trunk road would be built through it, but that prediction proved false. When they arrived, they faced a lot of challenges. Rival shopkeepers viewed Mr. Biswas as a threat, and even Shama was unhappy about the place. She made meals in the small kitchen in the yard, but even when the surroundings were depressing, Mr. Biswas took some satisfaction in eating a meal prepared in a house that was his own. A house blessing ceremony was planned, and the Tulsis came to conduct it, which pleased Shama very much. Shama returned home for her delivery and gave birth to a daughter. She named her Savi without consulting Mr. Biswas. Although Biswas initially found success as a shopkeeper, managing credit with customers became a headache. One such customer was Mungru, who owed Mr. Biswas quite a bit of money. But Biswas was afraid to approach him because he was a renowned stick fighter. Anyway, eventually Mungru's refusal to pay led to a confrontation. Mr. Biswas sought help from Brabourne, a strict Hindu lawyer, and legal proceedings followed. However, Mungru responded with a countersuit for damaging his reputation. On Brabourne's advice, Mr. Biswas settled out of court by paying Mungru a substantial amount to drop the case. He realized that the whole thing was a scam set up by Brabourne and Mungru's lawyer. He recognized the complexity and cost of the situation. With the new baby on the way, life at the Chase became increasingly strained. During the 6 years at the Chase, Shama and his daughter Savi became more and more distant from Mr. Biswas. During this time, Shama also gave birth to a son, Anand. But Anand too, like his sister Savi, spent more and more time with the Tulsis. When Shama became pregnant for the 3rd time, Mr. Biswas hit her during an argument. She was prompted to leave him. He did not see her again until after their daughter Mena was born. At that point, they reconciled. Meanwhile, running the shop was becoming a burden for Mr. Biswas. Seth advised that the best plan was to first insure the shop and then burn it down, making it look like Mungru was to blame. He told Mr. Biswas to alert the police about his encounters with Mungru before burning down the shop. Mr. Biswas followed the plan. When they left the Chase, they were burdened by debts and a sense of futility. This time, Mr. Biswas and his family moved to a sugarcane plantation in Green Vale. This plantation was owned by Seth, and Mr. Biswas was to work as a driver. They had to live in the barracks with the laborers who were suspicious of Mr. Biswas and jealous of his earnings, which were twice theirs. Greenvale was surrounded by trees. The barracks were made of wood with a corrugated iron roof that extended to create 12 open kitchen spaces, one for each family. As a driver, Mr. Biswas had an end room with a back window nailed shut and walls covered in newspapers. He was earning $25 a month. Seth, who inspected and paid the laborers every Saturday, used Mr. Biswas's green kitchen table for payments. Mr. Biswas enjoyed the authority he had on Saturdays, but struggled on other days as the laborers often fooled him. Seth promised to build Mr. Biswas a house, but that promise was never fulfilled. Mr. Biswas blamed Shama and her family for his situation. His frustrations led to Shama leaving for Hanuman House. Seth would deliver messages from Shama on Saturdays. One day he brought the promised insurance money from the shop at the Chase, which was $75. Mr. Biswas was determined to save money for a house of his own and to reclaim his children from the Tulsis. He had pictured a real home with concrete steps and a veranda. Shama stayed at Hanuman house for long periods, so Mr. Biswas learned to cook for himself. During Christmas, he visited Hanuman house with an expensive doll house for Savi, but forgot to buy anything for the others. Mrs. Tulsi was furious. When Mr. Biswas returned the next week with a toy car for Anand, he discovered that Shama had destroyed the dollhouse. He was shocked. He took Savi back to the barracks, leaving Shama and the rest of the family behind. Savi, his daughter, had a lonely week. Mr. Biswas tried to entertain her, but she remained depressed. Shama's return brought some temporary relief, but Biswas felt betrayed when he saw Savi was so excited when her mother returned. Shama apologized and explained that her actions were prompted by her family's jealousy and outrage over the extravagant dollhouse. Biswas was determined to build his own house, and he chose a site near the barracks and consulted with a builder named George McLean. Edgar, a laborer, helped clear the site. Seth offered some sheet metal for the roof at $3. They started the construction, and Biswas felt a renewed sense of purpose. But the laborers repeatedly threatened him, and a storm caused severe damage to the house. Mr. Biswas felt lonely and helpless. His anxiety overshadowed his efforts, and he sank into deep depression. Shama left him again, but this time Anand stayed back. Though the house was incomplete, Mr. Biswas decided to move himself and Anand into it, hoping to improve his mood. Yet, everything was in vain. Mr. Biswas's dog Tarzan was brutally killed, and a lightning strike nearly destroyed the house. When the Tulsi household learned about Mr. Biswas's sad state, they brought him and Anand back to Hanuman house. The family took care of him, and Chinta looked after Anand. Mr. Biswas's brothers, Pratap and Prasad, and his sister Dehuti's husband Ramchand came to visit. Ramchand invited Mr. Biswas to stay with them in Port of Spain once he recovered. Seth revealed that the laborers in Greenvale had burned the house down. Shama gave birth to another girl, Kamla. Mr. Biswas decided that he could not live off the Tulsis forever and needed to make his own way in the world. He packed his few belongings and left Hanuman house without his wife and children. As he walked through the bustling high street, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and was ready to face whatever lay ahead. He arrived in Port of Spain carrying only a cardboard suitcase. Initially, he was not sure where to go. As he stood at a road junction, a bus conductor seized him and insisted he board the bus to Port of Spain. He remembered Ramchand's invitation and decided to go to their place in Port of Spain. As the bus moved north, Mr. Biswas was fascinated by the changing landscape. When the bus finally arrived in Port of Spain, he first felt apprehensive. Yet, as he stepped off the bus and into the city's hustle and bustle, his uncertainty was replaced by a sense of freedom and excitement. He made his way to the address provided by Ramchand. Ramchand and his wife Dehuti welcomed him warmly. They were excited to have him stay, especially after learning that he had left Shama. Ramchand encouraged Mr. Biswas to rest and enjoy the gramophone. Living with Ramchand and Dehuti, Mr. Biswas experienced a new kind of life. The crowds, the facilities, and the diversity of its inhabitants fascinated him. Ramchand took Mr. Biswas to local attractions like the botanical gardens, rock gardens, and government house. He learned to appreciate urban life, and he was contrasting it with his past experiences. Days turned into weeks. He started to feel the necessity of earning a living. He thought about various job options, including working in a mental hospital. He thought of painting signs, but he was not sure how to restart. In a moment of desperation, Mr. Biswas decided to visit a specialist doctor. However, feeling out of place and embarrassed by his shabby appearance, he left without seeing the doctor. He was determined to make a change. Mr. Biswas headed to the offices of the Trinidad Sentinel, a local newspaper. He was hired as a sign painter, which marked the beginning of his career in journalism. He quickly adapted to the sensational style preferred by the Sentinel, finding a niche in writing engaging stories. His flair for storytelling and fantasy became an asset in his new role. Mr. Biswas's success as a reporter brought him a sense of stability and pride. His name frequently appeared in the paper, giving him the confidence to return to Hanuman House. His children and Shama received him with open arms. Mrs. Tulsi, his mother-in-law, offered him and his family a home she owned in Port of Spain, and Mr. Biswas readily accepted. With a stable job and growing recognition, he began to envision a better future for himself and his family. Mrs. Tulsi returned to Hanuman House, leaving the Biswas family alone in Port of Spain. Mr. Biswas tried to restore his garden, but was often haunted by the uncertainty of their tenure in the house. The Tulsi family began to fragment as Mrs. Tulsi became more withdrawn due to her failing health, and Seth's control over the family weakened. The Biswas family felt less welcome at Hanuman House during their Christmas visits and started to become more independent from the Tulsis. Biswas faced significant challenges when Mr. Burnett, the editor of the Sentinel, was fired. The new management was a conservative one. It focused on factual reporting rather than sensationalism. This stifled Mr. Biswas's creative expression. He dreaded dismissal and felt increasingly disconnected from his work. The family struggled financially as prices rose due to the ongoing Second World War. Shama meticulously managed the household budget, but the scarcity of basic goods led to frequent quarrels between her and Mr. Biswas. He found solace in literature, particularly in the works of Dickens. Anand sought ways to avoid school because of the oppressive environment and high expectations. The weekends were a relief to Mr. Biswas and his children. They visited Tara and Ajodha's new house. However, Shama remained isolated from both Hanuman House and the new acquaintances in Port of Spain. One day, Seth shows up unexpectedly in Port of Spain, and he destroyed the garden to clear space for a shed to park his trucks. Shama returned to Hanuman House to tell her mother what Seth had done. She discovered that the rift between Seth and the rest of the family had become permanent. Seth and his family had left Hanuman House, and the Tulsis had decided to move to Short Hills, an estate northeast of Port of Spain in the mountains. Shama wanted to move with her family to the new estate, and Mr. Biswas had to agree. Arriving at Short Hills, Mr. Biswas was enchanted by the estate's landscape, solitude, and fruitful bushes. He built his own small house on the estate, separate from the Tulsis. The house was completed in less than a month, following the same pattern as the one he had attempted in Greenvale. It had a veranda, 2 bedrooms, and a drawing room standing on tall pillars. Estate trees provided the timber. He only paid for sawing. He brought corrugated iron for the roof, plain and frosted glass for the windows, colored glass for the drawing room door, and cement for the pillars. Living in Short Hills was hard for the kids. They couldn't easily get to school and missed out on fun things like movies and games. Mr. Biswas felt even more apart from his children because they had to leave for school really early and didn't get home until late at night. He asked his mother, Deepti, to live with them. She helped with chores and cleaning up the land. Having her around made the house feel peaceful. Shama treated Deepti with a lot of respect. But one day, when Mr. Biswas was burning some brush, the fire got out of control. They had to leave their house and go back to the main one to stay safe. The island was changing because of the war and the American military base. Transports became less dependable. At that time, Mrs. Tulsi's house in Port of Spain became empty and Biswas was given 2 rooms there, which he agreed to take. But he didn't move by himself. His brother-in-law and his wife, who Biswas nicknamed the Tuttles, came along too. Shama's sister Chinta, her husband Govind, and a widow named Bazdai, who took care of children, also moved back. The house was always busy with lots of people. The Tuttles took up most of the space, leaving just 1 room for Govind and Chinta, and Bazdai stayed in a small room. Biswas managed to get 2 rooms for himself, but the noise was too much, especially when the Tuttles played the same record over and over on their music player. Tuttle and Govind argued about parking, and Mrs. Tulsi's daughters argued about chores every day. To make things worse, Bazdai started letting people from Short Hills stay, making the house even more crowded. The noise and chaos made Biswas and Anand go for long walks at night to get away from it all. In spite of the problems, Biswas and Mr. Tuttle became friends because they both felt like they didn't fit in with the Tulsi family. The busy and noisy home made Mr. Biswas stay longer at work in the Sentinel office. He got a new job there as an investigator for a fund to help people who were really poor. His job was to find these people all over Trinidad. Even though he had some problems like parts being stolen from his bike and people threatening him during his walk, he kept on doing his job well. When Mr. Biswas heard that his mother Bipti had died, he felt very sad. He felt that he had lost a big part of himself that had been with him for a long time. But then there was some good news. Anand did really well in his exams and got into college. This made him happy, and he decided he would do anything to help Anand with his studies, even though they didn't have much money. Mr. Biswas felt really happy when Anand got into college. He loved everything about the college, like its rules and events. He took special care of Anand's textbooks, making them look nice. Going to college events made him feel proud. Even though Maina didn't get a scholarship, he was still happy with what they achieved. But at the same time, he also felt sad. He had realized that his dream of owning a home was becoming harder to reach. During Anand's second year in college, Mr. Biswas felt more motivated with his job. He was known at the Sentinel for knowing a lot about social welfare. He met with charity groups and went to big events. Then one day, he got a message to meet the new boss of the community welfare department. He met Miss Logie there, who offered him a job. The pay was better than his job at the Sentinel. So he said yes and left his old job. Miss Logie, who was tall and full of energy, treated Biswas nicely, like they were on the same level. She even invited the Biswases to stay at her beach house in Sans Souci, and they happily said yes. They enjoyed the ride there and were excited to relax by the sea. But the vacation brought mixed feelings. They liked the sea and beaches, but the big empty house and its surroundings made them feel a bit uneasy. Once they returned to Port of Spain, the family got back into their usual routines. Biswas felt better with his new job, even though people were watching closely how the department worked. He worked hard, doing surveys and writing reports, and the department gave him a car, which made him proud and excited. He even learned to drive and loved showing off the car. He gave his old bike to Anand, but even with these changes, the family still had problems and faced the same challenges as before. When the Tuttles said they were leaving, Mr. Biswas hoped his family could have their rooms, but Mrs. Tulsi came back and took over the house again. Her health getting worse made things tense, as she needed a lot of care. Also, when Shama's brother Owad, who became a doctor, returned from studying abroad, the Biswases had to move to a not-so-nice room to make space for him. Mrs. Tulsi got better, and Owad became the leader of the family. The house was always busy, with lots of people visiting, especially on Sundays. But things got tense when Anand was rude to Owad during a card game, and Owad slapped him in front of everyone. Anand wanted to leave because he felt so embarrassed, and Mr. Biswas got angry over a fight and decided to leave too, telling Mrs. Tulsi he was going. The money was tight, but Mr. Biswas saw a chance to buy a 2-story house from a legal clerk who needed money to buy a better home for his mom. Mr. Biswas used some money from selling his house in Short Hills and got the rest as a loan from Ajodha. Shama wasn't sure it was a good idea, but Biswas decided to buy the house anyway. The house had more problems than they realized at first. The staircase was unsafe, with old pillars and no back door. The windows didn't close properly, and some doors were stuck shut or wouldn't open. When it rained, the yard turned into mud because there was no drainage. Even though the walls had just been painted, there were cracks in them and the smell of paint lingered. They started fixing things. A worker built a drain and a sink, while 2 painters worked for low pay. Finally, they could leave the old house. They hired a truck, packed their furniture, and moved to their new home. Mr. Biswas made friends with the neighbor, an older Indian man. The neighbor explained that the person who owned the house before them had built it using weak materials like hollow bricks for the pillars. Wanting to make their home better, they fixed the fence, made a garage, and started a garden. When the Tuttles visited, they liked what they saw. Plus, the children were pleased. It felt like their real home, more than any other place they had lived before. Sometime later, Biswas saw the clerk looking at the land next door, planning to build another tall house. Biswas checked his own land and realized the clerk had used 12 feet of it. Biswas took back the space and planted a laburnum tree there. It grew quickly and made the house look more charming. Even though They were disappointed at first. The house started feeling like home. The kids settled in fast, and life in the tall, square house on Sikkim Street felt organized and sensible. When the evenings were calm and warm, the smell of the laburnum flowers filled the house, making it a cozy and proud place for Mr. Biswas and his family. Before the year was over, Owad left Port of Spain, and by the end of the year, they closed down the community welfare department. The department wasn't needed anymore because things had changed a lot. Remember the war? And there was influence of America. Miss Logie also left at the time. Mr. Biswas went back to working at the Sentinel. Even though he had his own car, he didn't make much money and had trouble paying his debts. An Englishman wanted to buy the car, but because of Sharma, Mr. Biswas decided to keep it, even though he really didn't want to. But the debt was a big problem. Mr. Biswas couldn't pay back what he owed Ajodha. His job at the Sentinel felt boring and repetitive. Life seemed like it was just waiting around, except for the kids doing well. Savi got a scholarship and went overseas. Then Anand followed 2 years later. This meant they had more expenses now and couldn't pay off the debt as quickly. But it also gave Mr. Biswas some hope. Anand used to write letters often, but then he stopped. One day, Mr. Biswas got very sick at work and had to stay in the hospital for a month. When he came home, the doctor said he couldn't go up the stairs anymore, so he had to live downstairs. He went back to work, but they fired him soon after. He wrote many letters to Anand, but Anand only sent short replies. Mr. Biswas thought about borrowing more money to bring Anand back home, but it didn't work out. Savi came back and got a good job. Mr. Biswas was happy to have her around. He wrote happy letters to Anand about their trips and how nice the garden was looking. He passed away without seeing Anand again. The newspaper announced his death as "Journalist dies suddenly." Sharma's sisters came to help her. Many people dressed nicely came to the house for the funeral. The health department allowed his cremation, which had many different people attending. Sharma and the children didn't go back to the Tulsis. Instead, they went back to the house Mr. Biswas bought for them. This brings us to the end of Mr. Biswas and the story about his house. Tell me, how did you find the story? If you like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to our channel and stay connected. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Till we meet again, bye-bye.